It was a quiet morning in Glendale. The sidewalk outside the neighborhood coffee shop was crowded with people enjoying their morning beverages, and the sky was a vivid blue. Michael Carter, a blind man who came to the store every day, was one of them, sitting calmly at an outdoor table. Zeus, his faithful German shepherd, stood watch at his side. Zeus was more than just a canine guide. Years of training as a former K-9 unit had given him a commanding appearance and a solid posture. Zeus, who is now retired, had devoted his life to Michael's protection, providing him with emotional support and direction that the guy really valued. The sound of 3 motorcycles roaring into a position next to the cafe interrupted Michael's quiet coffee drinking. Everyone in the vicinity turned to watch the booming motors. 3 men, wearing leather jackets with eye-catching patches, got off their horses. Although they appeared relaxed, there was a hint of stress in the way they looked around. Chuck was the group's leader, and he exuded authority. As he spoke to his companions, he made passionate gestures and laughed loudly and confidently, establishing his control over the room. Constantly on guard, Zeus pricked his ears, sensing something out of the ordinary. Between the tables, the men started to walk and observe individuals. Chuck stopped to look at the German shepherd after noticing Zeus and Michael. "You have a big dog there," he said, his tone causing Zeus to meet his gaze. Chuck leaned forward a little, as though to gauge the dog's response, and laughed at his own remark. Zeus remained still, but there was a hidden warning in his posture that said a lot about how he perceived the situation. Chuck made a dramatic hand gesture, as though he were making a joke, maybe to prove something. "Is he as intelligent as he seems?" His friends gave him an uncomfortable laugh when he inquired. The air became more strained. Zeus stayed still, but he never took his eyes off Chuck. Unaware of the looks around him, Michael inquired, "Is everything okay?" There was a note of anxiety in his voice, even though it sounded calm, as though he could tell Zeus's conduct had changed. The conversation around them was in stark contrast to the silence at the table. As a dog accustomed to high-pressure scenarios, Zeus had learned to remain composed until the appropriate time. Chuck retreated a little when he realized he hadn't received the response he had hoped for, but his laugh reverberated. Michael leaned out to touch Zeus, still unaware of what was going on. "Are you all right, friend?" Gently he inquired. Zeus moved a little closer to him in response, but his gaze never left Chuck, who was beginning to realize the consequences of his own behavior. The cafe's little outdoor space appeared to change the mood. Chuck and his group's laughter, now tinged with a suggestive tone, became louder as Michael drank his coffee. Zeus stood still at Michael's side, but anyone paying careful attention could see that he was constantly on guard. His gaze followed Chuck's every step, and his muscles tensed, as though he was waiting for something. He was a protector trained to protect at all costs, not simply a dog. Feeling like the life of the party, Chuck went over to Michael's table. He appeared to be totally unaware that other customers were observing. "You have a pretty puppy here, don't you?" he said in jest, but with a tinge of contempt. In an attempt to lighten the mood, Michael smiled slightly. "Regards. My best friend is Zeus." Chuck cocked his head, pretending to be interested. "Zeus what?" "The name of a Greek god. We'll see if he fulfills it." Chuck moved quickly, reaching out to brush Zeus' snout before Michael could react. Although it would have appeared innocuous to passersby, Zeus, who is trained to recognize danger, needed only this gesture to set off his senses. The German shepherd gave a low warning growl and backed off instead of attacking. An awkward hush descended upon the area as the tension surrounding them increased. Chuck raised his hands, perhaps in jest, and remarked, "Easy there, boy." However, a gleam of challenge was there in his eyes. Michael tried to soothe Zeus by putting his palm on his neck, but he was still unable to comprehend what was occurring. "I apologize if he frightened you," he stated in a sincere tone. Chuck merely chuckled, but the dog's response appeared to have wounded his ego. His pals began to make fun of him after he took a step back. "Will you allow a dog to correct you, Chuck?" The mood was altered by that single sentence. Chuck returned Zeus' glance with a determined smile, hoping to make an impression. The group leader glanced around and saw that a large number of people were observing the exchange. Some even used their phones to covertly record. He wasn't the kind to back down, but perhaps that caused him to hesitate for a second. He responded dismissively, "Calm down, people. It's just a dog." Zeus, however, was aware of the distinction between danger and play, and Michael began to sense that something wasn't quite right, even if he couldn't see it. "What's wrong, Zeus?" he whispered. The German Shepherd simply stared at Chuck, as though anticipating his next action. Chuck backed off a little, but not far enough to be a retreat. His comrades continued to insult him and laugh, which seemed to bolster the biker's already damaged pride. He paused, gazing at Zeus as though he were daring the dog to move. It was nearly impossible to feel the tension in the air. Michael attempted to lighten the situation with a remark, but he was still oblivious to the menacing glances and the impending danger. When someone comes on too strongly, he dislikes it. Chuck disregarded the remark, perhaps because it worried him. As though seeking approval for his impending action, he looked first at his pals and then at others around him. Grinning icily, he stepped closer to Zeus and held out his hand once more. Zeus, who was still sitting, gave a low growl that anyone who could read it might understand. Though nearly inaudible, the sound was strong enough to cause the people watching to wince in alarm. Chuck, though, was intent on pushing the boundaries. Chuck forced a giggle and added, "Come on, big guy. Do you appear as tough as you are?" This time, Chuck nudged the side of Michael's chair softly before the German Shepherd could respond, causing Zeus to rise in a single, forceful motion. The animal's last straw was that gesture. Zeus's posture shifted, but he did not charge. His body was stiff now, like a bowstring about to break, and he was completely awake. A few others held up their phones to record the sight as the surrounding throng started to grumble. Michael furrowed his brow as he noticed Zeus's altered conduct. Attempting to soothe the dog by rubbing his fingers over his neck, he realized that something was amiss. "What's happening?" With a troubled gaze, he asked out loud. Chuck merely chuckled, but it was a trembling laugh. In front of his friends and the audience, he appeared unable to back down, even though he knew he was playing with fire. "Nothing really," he said, indicating that Michael should calm down. "We're merely playing around." Just then, a woman who had been seated close got up. "Hey," she said forcefully, "you must stop this. Don't bother the dog." Chuck hesitated for the first time as her words reverberated over the walkway. He looked around, aware of the judgmental looks, and embarrassment took control. Zeus remained motionless, gazing at Chuck, poised to respond to any hint of danger. Like a rope on the verge of breaking, the tension lingered in the air. Chuck gave the woman who was addressing him a narrowed look, but remained silent. He, Zeus, and Michael, who now appeared even more perplexed, exchanged glances as the throng surrounding them began to become restless. Chuck took a step back as he felt the unease increase, but it wasn't a permanent retreat. He was thinking of something else. Trying to preserve what remained of his image, he replied dismissively, "Relax, we're just having fun." On the inside, however, he felt compelled to show his might. Zeus, however, stayed motionless, watching each motion with surgical accuracy, seemingly predicting the biker's next move. Michael gripped Zeus' leash tighter while whispering, "Calm down. What's going on, Zeus?" Although he was unable to see Chuck's menacing posture, he could sense the tension in the room. Zeus wasn't your typical canine. He was in full alert mode at that moment, as he had been trained to guard. Although Michael had entire faith in him, he became nervous due to the increasing stress. The surrounding crowd appeared to be still, and the eerie quiet made everything even more unnerving. Chuck suddenly took a quick action. He acted impulsively and kicked one of the surrounding chairs, pushing it in Zeus' direction while feigning to back off. A few individuals gasped in astonishment as the sound of metal hitting the ground reverberated down the street. Zeus responded immediately, taking a sidestep and swerving around the chair with remarkable dexterity. The dog's defensive posture was now even more apparent as he growled louder. He made it very evident that he would not put up with any more provocation. "Stop, please!" The woman yelled once more firmly this time. Other voices began to rise, urging Chuck to halt, but he appeared to be stuck in his own ego. "What's wrong? Have you never witnessed a person playing with a dog before? Try not to seem too serious," he said. However, his hands were clenched, and it was obvious that he had lost control. Zeus remained steadfast, his gaze fixed on Chuck as though he were observing every move and prepared to take action if needed. At last, Michael became aware that something significant was taking place. With a steady hold on Zeus's leash, he rose slowly to his feet. Could someone please explain the situation? His concern was clearly evident as he questioned out loud. Chuck, however, moved forward before anyone could reply, bending in Michael's direction as though to directly threaten him. As if sensing the danger to his owner, Zeus lowered his head slightly, ready to defend Michael at all costs, as the crowd held its breath. When Chuck stepped closer to Michael, the tension peaked. Even to the blind, his presence was oppressive because he was now so close. "What's the matter, friend? Are you hiding behind your dog?" Chuck laughed sarcastically, as if to conceal his own uneasiness. Michael, however, maintained his composure despite a little wobble in his voice. "Zeus never conceals me from anything," he said, firmly holding the dog's leash. "He appears to know something that I do not, and he is here to protect me." Zeus remained still, but the growl in his throat became more intense by the moment. The previously reticent throng was now beginning to mutter more loudly, obviously uneasy with Chuck's actions. At last, an elderly man seated at a nearby table got up and stepped in. "Hey, you should go now before something goes wrong since this has gotten out of hand." However, Chuck disregarded the counsel due to his pride and the pressure from his pals. He treated the man as though he were simply another barrier, but his face was starting to reveal signs of pain. An unexpected sound abruptly pierced the silence. Chuck took an involuntary step back when Zeus let out a loud, deep, and solid bark. Its meaning was obvious, and the sound was unavoidable. The dog was all set to go. Astonished, the crowd reacted, with some backing away and others filming. The energy changed entirely. Zeus's bark alerted Michael to the imminence of a dangerous situation. "It's all right, Zeus." He tried to reassure the German shepherd, saying, "I'm fine." Zeus, however, continued to stare at Chuck as though to convey that he didn't believe what he was saying. Chuck then hastily moved forward to push Michael by the shoulder in a last-ditch effort to preserve his reputation. It was a swift motion, but not fast enough for Zeus to miss it. In an instant, the German shepherd sprang to put himself between Chuck and Michael, putting himself squarely between the motorcyclist and his owner. Instead of attacking, Zeus remained resolute, his teeth slightly exposed, a stark reminder that this had to stop there. There was utter silence on the street. Zeus' eyes seemed to pierce Chuck as he stopped, unable to respond. Michael raised his head and firmly said, "I think it's best if you leave now," realizing that something very terrible had just occurred. They heard murmurs from the surrounding audience, this time directed toward Chuck. Looking around, he saw that he was no longer in control. He backed away slowly, trying to conceal his shame without further word. Silently, his pals trailed behind him, and in a matter of seconds, the gang disappeared around the corner. Murmurs and stress dominated the morning, which had begun with the gentle tones of routine. Michael sensed a change in the atmosphere. He sensed a change in energy even though he couldn't see it. The distant roar of motorcycles was drowned out by the muffled sound of individuals discussing what they had seen. By his side, Zeus remained vigilant, his body still rigid, although his front paws had a slight tremble. Michael knelt down and felt the German shepherd's fur after sensing the vibration via the leash. In an attempt to soothe him, he whispered, "It's all right now, friend." Zeus, however, appeared to pause, his eyes remaining on the location where Chuck had vanished. He seemed to understand that humans were a problem that might reappear rather than merely being a short-term threat. Michael said, "You feel something I don't you?" as he lightly touched Zeus' muzzle. Despite their simplicity, these words were very powerful. They demonstrated his steadfast faith in his faithful friend. A few people remained nearby, still intrigued, while the rest of the gathering gradually started to thin out. With a worried expression on her face, the woman who had accosted Chuck walked a few paces in Michael's direction. "Are you all right?" Her voice was still shaking from the adrenaline when she asked. Although he nodded, Michael's worried expression was visible through his furrowed brows. Zeus has never responded this way before, but I'm all right. I'm concerned because he is aware of when something is amiss. The woman knelt down and watched Zeus intently. This dog isn't your typical dog, is he? Michael exhaled, his face displaying a mixture of sadness and pride. No, he was a dog bred to defend, to serve, to give up everything if needed. However, that was years ago. I assumed he had moved on from all of that. He is now my family and my mentor. As though attempting to interpret something that only Zeus understood, the woman gazed into his eyes. She said, almost whispering, "Perhaps he never forgot who he is." The elderly man who had stepped in earlier took a step forward. He started, "Listen, son," in a deep, wise voice. He and other dogs have instincts that are beyond our comprehension. That was not a random reaction on his part. You ought to have faith in him and perhaps remain vigilant. Chuck seemed to be the kind of man who didn't give up easy. Michael found resonance in the stranger's comments and loosened Zeus' leash. The German shepherd gave him a glance. There was something in his eyes that words could never describe. A faraway sound, the roar of engines, broke the silence. They hadn't quite vanished, but they weren't any closer either. As he stroked Zeus' head, Michael inhaled deeply. Perhaps it's all in my head, he thought. Zeus's body trembled, however, indicating differently. He was unaware that this episode was only the start of something much more significant. Something that would challenge Michael's fortitude in the face of adversity, as well as Zeus' faithfulness. For Zeus, the strain appeared to have finally subsided. He was lying beside Michael now, but his respiration was still a little too rapid. Every movement surrounding them is picked up by his eyes. Michael decided it was time to leave the cafe after noticing the dog's uneasiness. He picked up the leash and carefully got to his feet, smiling nervously at the few individuals who were still in the area. "I appreciate you staying." Before heading down the walkway, he remarked, "I think Zeus and I need some fresh air." The daily routine for Michael and Zeus was to stroll home, but every step felt heavy with significance that morning. Only the faint tinkling of the leash and the sound of Zeus' paws on the sidewalk shattered the silence. Zeus' actions shouted louder than any visual cue, even though Michael was blind. His stance indicated that he was on high alert, and he was tense. It served as a subliminal but persistent reminder that something was still amiss. Zeus was free to move about Michael's tiny flat after they got there, and he unclipped the leash. Michael said as he groped for Zeus' water bowl around the kitchen counter, "You're acting strange today, buddy." As though doing an examination, the German shepherd sniffed every nook of the flat as it proceeded carefully. At last, he paused at the door, sitting calmly but alertly, listening for any outside noise. Michael furrowed his brow in recognition. "What's happening? Zeus? This is something you never do." Michael started to recall the tales he had heard about Zeus prior to adopting him as he sat on the couch, attempting to make sense of what had happened that morning. He was aware that Zeus had a history as a dog, but he had never been fully informed. Zeus's ability to sense danger had saved lives in difficult situations. And suddenly those instincts seemed to be coming back. "Boy, what are you trying to tell me?" Michael questioned while stroking the dog's silky coat. Zeus merely waggled his tail in response, but his gaze remained fixed on the door. The faraway sound of a motorcycle reverberated outside. Zeus lifted his head almost imperceptibly, his entire body tensing again. Michael sensed the dog's response even though he didn't hear the sound. As he often did to console Zeus, he put a hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together, whatever it is," he added quietly. Michael had no idea that pledge would soon be put to the test in a way he could never have predicted. The nightfall arrived in silence, shrouding the little community in peace. Zeus was at Michael's side as he sat at his simple dining table, meticulously chopping an apple. Neither Zeus nor Michael could ignore the weight of the tension that had previously pervaded the room. As Michael talked, almost to himself, his fingertips touched Zeus' fur. "I might be overanalyzing this." He mumbled, "My friend," as if anticipating something Michael could not see. Zeus's ears perked up, and his keen gaze remained focused on the front entrance. The faint buzz of engines broke the silence outside. It was quiet at first, then louder and clearer. Zeus instantly got to his feet, his body tense, and gazed at the entrance. Michael froze when he noticed the shift. "Zeus, what is it?" With a steady yet worried tone, he questioned. A crushing quiet strained on the apartment's thin walls as the engines abruptly halted. Michael's fingers shook a little as he reached for his phone. Even though his heart was racing in his chest, he told himself to remain cool. A harsh, purposeful knock reverberated through the flat a few moments later. With a deep growl, Zeus moved to stand between Michael and the door. After hesitating, Michael stood up, his hand firmly grasping Zeus' leash. "Who is it?" His voice was forceful but cautious as he cried out. There was merely the sound of faint whispers outside, no instant response. Michael's heartbeat accelerated. Through the leash, yes, ends Zeus's tightness, the dog's willingness to protect if needed. Michael said, "Until you identify yourself, I won't open the door." At last, a deep, strangely familiar voice answered. "It's just me, Chuck, so calm down, man." Michael's spine tingled at the words. Zeus snarled, his growl growing louder. Michael took a step back, increasing the distance from the entrance, and his hand grip tightened on the leash. "What are you looking for?" His voice was tinged with skepticism as he asked. Chuck tried to appear informal, but it was obvious that he was acting dangerously. "I didn't want to offend you previously, did I? I just wanted to chat, guy." Michael's thoughts raced, considering his possibilities, so he didn't respond right away. Sensing the seriousness of the situation, Zeus stayed calm and vigilant. Michael could feel the weight of Chuck's presence just beyond the door as the silence dragged on. At last, Michael remarked in a steady but determined voice, "You must go." Outside, the muttering became more intense, and then there was the sound of retreating footsteps. However, neither Michael nor Zeus relaxed. The experience felt incomplete in some way, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. Chuck's departure was followed by a brief period of uncomfortable silence. In an attempt to quiet his mind, Michael traversed the living room, his fingers delicately following the well-known shapes of the furniture. But Zeus wasn't at ease. His big body tensed, he walked to the window, sniffed the air, and gazed into the darkness. "Zeus, what is it?" Michael asked himself more questions than the dog did. The nagging suspicion that Chuck wasn't done with the game he was playing was making him feel more and more uneasy. A few minutes later, the silence was broken by the sound of footsteps. They circled the apartment building's perimeter, methodical and hushed. Zeus's body coiled like a spring as he gave a harsh bark. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he froze. His fingers fumbled as he reached for the countertop phone and dialed 911. Despite the cries of every nerve in his body, he told himself to remain calm. With a low, continuous growl that sent a reverberating warning through the little apartment, Zeus moved to stand at the entrance. Michael's voice was trembling as he described the issue to the emergency operator. As the dog's growls increased in volume, he gripped Zeus's leash tightly and added, "There's someone outside my apartment. They seem like problems to me." The minutes seemed to drag on for hours, but the dispatcher reassured him that officers were on their way. The footsteps outside became closer and more purposeful. Then Michael heard a faint, ominous sound that made him shudder. Something scraping across the glass pane. Suddenly, the scraping ceased, and a muttered curse came from outside. With his body pressed against the door, as if to challenge the visitor to approach, Zeus growled once more, louder this time. Michael backed into the room's corner, his mind racing, his hand still firmly gripping Zeus's leash. Relying on Zeus's intuition and the faith that assistance would come in time, he felt powerless. Even though he was terrified, he said in a firm voice, "They're coming, Zeus. Hold on." The tense air was finally broken by the faint screech of police sirens. The sound of footfall outside stopped instantly, and then there was the sound of a person fleeing. Zeus was still on high alert, his growl becoming softer but not completely gone. With a shaky exhale, Michael whispered into the receiver while holding the phone, "They're present. Thank you." He felt a brief wave of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this was far from done. Michael realized he had to get ready for whatever was about to happen since Chuck had gone too far. Two policemen were approaching Michael's apartment, when the street was filled with an unsettling glow from the flashing red and blue lights. Zeus waited near the door, his body tense and his ears perked up, still alert. With caution, Michael opened the door and felt the cool night air rush into his face. "Thank you for coming, officers," he remarked. Despite the terror still present in his chest, he spoke steadily. Zeus remained tense, his keen eyes darting to the darkness beyond as though danger still loomed. Michael was asked to detail everything by the officers, who took notes as he talked about the earlier altercation with Chuck and the unsettling noises coming from his flat. Michael gripped Zeus's leash hard and said, "He didn't do anything physical, but he's unpredictable, and I know he'll come back." Zeus stayed tense, staring at the perimeter as one of the officers bent down to pet him. "Your dog has good instincts," the officer added. "You are right to use caution if he is this agitated." New footprints were found next to Michael's window when the officers searched the area. Despite following the trail, Chuck and his companions were nowhere to be seen. According to one of them, he's most likely long gone. However, their tone lacked confidence. Michael was told to stay inside, keep his phone handy, and call in case anything else came up. The other officer promised him that patrols would be increased in the area. However, don't be afraid to spend the night elsewhere if you feel uneasy. Michael didn't intend to run, but he nodded. He wasn't going to let Chuck take away his home, which was this. Silence weighed down the flat after the officers had left. Zeus was still on guard at his feet as Michael sat on the side of his bed. Feeling grounded by the familiar motion, he reached down to stroke the dog's back. "Zeus," he said, "I don't know what's coming next, but I'm confident you'll be prepared." The sound of his speech caused Zeus's ears to flicker, and his tail wagged faintly for the first time that night. In the middle of the uncertainty, it was a brief moment of comfort. At last, Michael fell asleep, but it was a restless and erratic slumber. Constantly on guard, Zeus stood at the door, his body a wall between Michael and the outside world. Never before had their link felt so solid, forged in the furnace of mutual trust and dread. Michael was convinced of one thing, regardless of what Chuck had planned. He was not alone in this. Zeus wasn't just a guide dog or a dog in training. He served as a partner, a guardian, and a reminder of the power that comes from unity.
Disclaimer. This channel stands against all forms of intolerance, discrimination, racism, and violations of human rights. The stories shared here are original creations, developed to encourage reflection, understanding, and constructive dialogue. All content is produced with a commitment to respecting diversity and honoring human dignity.